daughter Zoe makes $2,200 lifeguarding one summer, genuinely proud of her first real paycheck, the kind of pride that comes from earning money entirely on your own for the very first time. Camille puts that same $2,200 into an account for her and tells her almost nothing about what it actually is, just that it's for later, a phrase vague enough that Zoe doesn't think to ask a single follow-up question. Here's what for later actually means in this specific case. That $2,200, left alone until Zoe turns 65, has roughly 49 years to compound completely tax-free. The identical amount invested at 26 instead of 16 loses out on 10 of the most valuable years that money will ever have. Here's the number that should stop you mid-scroll. A single $2,200 contribution made at 16, growing at a conservative long-term average, can realistically become somewhere north of $80,000 by retirement, completely tax-free, from one summer of lifeguarding and one account almost nobody sets up. This isn't a video telling you every teenager needs a retirement account, or that you should pressure your kid into investing their allowance. It's a video about a specific, narrow window that only opens for a few years and closes the moment a teenager stops having earned income as a minor. Let me show you exactly how it works. My name is Alex, and today on Wealth Adjacent, we're taking apart the account with the best compounding runway of any account you'll ever open for your kid, and almost nobody's ever heard of it. Quick disclaimer, not financial advice, just an explanation of how custodial Roth IRA rules currently work, which can shift over time as regulations get updated. Let's meet Camille. Financially careful, contributes to her own retirement diligently. She genuinely didn't know this specific account existed for Zoe until a coworker mentioned it almost by accident. Here's the actual mechanism. A custodial Roth IRA works exactly like an adult Roth IRA. Contributions grow tax-free, and qualified withdrawals in retirement come out completely tax-free too. No difference in the underlying rules, simply because the account holder happens to be a minor. The one requirement that makes it available to a minor at all is earned income. A real job, W-2 or self-employment, babysitting, lawn care, lifeguarding, anything the IRS would recognize as genuine work with a documented paper trail behind it. Here's the part that should make you sit up. The contribution doesn't have to come from the teenager's own pocket at all. As of 2026, up to $7,500, or the teen's total earned income for the year, whichever is smaller, can be contributed by anyone, a parent, a grandparent, an aunt, as long as the total doesn't exceed what the teen actually earned that specific year. Zoe can spend every dollar of her actual paycheck on whatever a 16-year-old spends money on, while Camille separately contributes an equivalent amount into the Roth IRA on her behalf, effectively matching her daughter's earned income dollar for dollar, without touching a single cent of what Zoe actually took home. Run the actual math on why the timing matters this much, because the specific numbers make it concrete in a way the general concept doesn't. $2,200 invested at 16, left completely untouched, has roughly 49 years to compound before a typical retirement age. The same $2,200 invested for the first time at 26 instead has only 39 years, 10 fewer years sitting right at the very front of the compounding curve where those years matter disproportionately. At a conservative long-term average return, that 10-year head start alone can be worth more than double the final amount, purely from when the money started working, with zero difference in how much was actually contributed or how it was invested along the way. Where does the tax advantage specifically come from at this age? Most teenagers earn well below the standard deduction, meaning they owe little to no federal income tax on that money, regardless of what account it goes into or how it's structured. A traditional retirement account offers a tax deduction on contributions, which is nearly worthless to someone who barely owes any tax in the first place, since there's almost nothing to actually deduct against. A Roth IRA offers no upfront deduction, but completely tax-free growth and withdrawals instead, which means a teenager is, structurally, in close to the best possible tax position anyone will ever be in to choose the Roth version specifically. A position that quietly disappears the moment their income rises into a real tax bracket later in life. There's a specific detail worth naming clearly, since it removes the biggest hesitation parents actually have about locking up a teenager's own money. Contributions, though not the investment earnings on top of them, can be withdrawn at any time, for any reason, with zero taxes and zero penalty attached. This isn't money permanently locked away until retirement the way people often assume a retirement account has to work. It functions as a genuine emergency fund with a retirement account attached to it, which meaningfully lowers the risk of tying up a teenager's actual earnings in something they can't touch if they genuinely need it. There's a specific pattern worth naming around who actually qualifies, since the earned income requirement is the real gatekeeper here, not age at all. Formal employment with a W-2 obviously counts. Documented self-employment income, babysitting, mowing lawns, tutoring, content creation also counts, provided it's genuinely reported and there's a real paper trail the IRS could verify if it ever needed to look closely. Money from an allowance, gifts, or investment income specifically doesn't count, since none of that qualifies as earned income under the actual rule, regardless of how consistently or generously it gets given. There's a specific pattern worth naming around ownership and control too, since it's a detail that catches some families off guard. The money in a custodial Roth IRA legally belongs to the child from the moment it's contributed, the same as a custodial brokerage account. The parent manages it as custodian only until the child reaches the age of termination in their specific state, commonly 21, though this varies, at which point full control transfers to the now adult child, regardless of what anyone originally intended the money for. There's a specific compounding comparison worth walking through slowly, because the actual dollar gap here is easy to state and genuinely hard to intuit. A single $2,200 contribution at age 16, at a conservative long-term average return, realistically grows to somewhere in the range of $80,000 to $90,000 by a typical retirement age, from one contribution made once during a single summer job. The exact same $2,200 contributed for the first time at age 30 instead of 16 has 14 fewer years to compound. And the final result isn't just modestly smaller, it's frequently less than half the final total, purely from the delay. There's a specific reason that gap is so much larger than most people intuitively expect, worth naming directly. Compounding growth accelerates specifically in the later years of a long time horizon, meaning the years closest to retirement contribute the largest dollar amount of growth, but only because of the decades of smaller growth that happened first and kept building on themselves. Removing years from the beginning of that timeline doesn't just remove those specific years of growth, it removes the foundation everything afterward was compounding on top of. There's a specific pattern worth naming around what happens if this gets done incorrectly too, since it's worth understanding before assuming any contribution amount is automatically fine. Contributing more than a minor's actual documented earned income in a given year triggers a real IRS penalty, 6% annually on the excess amount. For every year the excess remains in the account uncorrected. This isn't a theoretical risk, it's precisely why the documentation requirement matters as much as it does, since an honest mistake about how much a teenager actually earned can turn into an ongoing, compounding penalty of its own. There's a psychological pattern worth naming here too, one specific to this exact age group. 16 and 17-year-olds are understandably not thinking in decades. A retirement account framed purely as for when you're 65 competes against every immediate want a first paycheck naturally creates, and losing that competition is completely understandable, not a failure of character. Reframing the account specifically as a flexible emergency fund that also happens to compound for retirement, rather than purely a retirement vehicle, tends to land considerably better with a teenager who has zero natural interest in a decades-away number. This is exactly where the previous video on college savings connects directly to this one, and it's worth naming the connection explicitly for anyone who's watched both. Retirement accounts, including a custodial Roth IRA, are excluded entirely from the reportable asset calculation on the federal financial aid formula. Money in this account isn't just growing tax-free, it's also invisible to the exact aid formula that penalizes custodial brokerage accounts so heavily, making it, structurally, one of the only accounts that's simultaneously a strong long-term investment and a financial aid neutral place to hold money for a teenager, a combination that's genuinely rare among the account types available to a minor. There's a specific pattern worth naming around documentation too, since it's the part most families get wrong in practice without ever intending to. The IRS can, and does, verify that a contribution doesn't exceed a minor's actual earned income, which means keeping pay stubs, A W-2, or clear self-employment records, isn't optional paperwork. It's the specific evidence that makes the entire contribution legitimate if it's ever questioned years down the line. A cash job with no documentation technically doesn't support a matching contribution, even if the work genuinely happened and the money genuinely changed hands. There's also a specific first-time homebuyer detail worth naming, since it adds a second layer of flexibility beyond the general emergency fund use of contributions. Beyond withdrawing contributions penalty-free at any time, up to a lifetime limit of investment earnings can also come out penalty-free specifically for a first home purchase, once the account has been open long enough to qualify. That means the same account genuinely can serve multiple purposes across a person's 20s, not just a distant retirement goal that feels abstract to a 16-year-old. There's a specific pattern worth naming around how young this can actually start too, since the age most people assume is required is usually higher than the real minimum. There's no minimum age requirement in the rule itself, only the earned income requirement, which means a child model, a young actor, or even a very young entrepreneur with genuine, documented self-employment income can technically qualify well before the teenage years most people picture. The earlier that window opens, the more dramatic the compounding advantage becomes, since a contribution at age 10 instead of 16 adds 6 additional years onto an already enormous runway. There's also a specific pattern worth naming around gig and informal work, since it's increasingly how a lot of teenagers actually earn money now. Content creation, reselling, tutoring through an app, dog walking through a platform that issues a 1099, all of it can qualify as legitimate earned income, provided it's actually reported and documented the way any self-employment income should be. The nature of teenage work has shifted considerably from the traditional part-time retail job, and the earned income requirement doesn't care which specific form that work takes, only that it's real and verifiable. There's a related exception worth naming for qualifying education expenses too, since it shows up in almost the same conversation people have about the homebuyer rule. Earnings withdrawn specifically for qualifying higher education costs can also avoid the early withdrawal penalty under certain conditions, though ordinary income tax may still apply to the earnings portion in that specific scenario, unlike the fully tax-free treatment a qualified retirement withdrawal receives. It's a narrower, more conditional exception than the homebuyer rule, but worth knowing it exists as one more point of flexibility layered into an account that started as a single summer's lifeguarding paycheck. So here's the actual check, worth running the first time a teenager has any documented earned income. Confirm the income is genuinely earned and documented, a real pay stub or 1099, not cash with no paper trail. Contribute up to the lesser of the teen's total earned income, or the annual limit, and invest it broadly rather than leaving it sitting in cash, since the entire value of this account comes specifically from decades of compounding growth, not from the contribution itself. There's a specific detail worth naming about what happens inside the account after the contribution too, since opening the account is only half the actual decision. A custodial Roth IRA that simply sits in cash captures almost none of the compounding advantage this entire video is built around, since cash doesn't meaningfully grow over decades the way a broadly diversified investment does. The specific investment choice inside the account, typically something broad and low cost given the multi-decade timeline involved, matters just as much as the decision to open the account and contribute to it in the first place. A few practical moves fall out of that. Open the account at any major brokerage that offers custodial IRAs. Most large firms do, and the process itself typically takes less time than opening a regular custodial brokerage account. Keep organized records of the teen's earned income each year the account gets funded, since that documentation is what makes the contribution defensible if it's ever questioned. And have an honest, age-appropriate conversation with the teenager about what the account actually is, since understanding it now is arguably as valuable as the compounding itself, given they'll be the one managing it entirely on their own in a few short years, once the age of termination arrives and the decisions become entirely theirs. It's worth being honest about the objections here too, since this isn't a decision without real trade-offs worth naming directly. First, isn't it a little much to ask a teenager to think about retirement? Shouldn't 16-year-olds just be allowed to enjoy their first paycheck without a lecture about compounding attached to it? Completely fair and worth taking seriously, which is exactly why the contribution doesn't have to come from the teen's own earnings at all. A parent or grandparent funding the account separately means the teenager keeps every dollar they actually earned, with none of the psychological weight of feeling like their money got taken away for a distant goal they don't yet care about, and honestly shouldn't be expected to. Second objection. What if the family genuinely can't afford to contribute on the teen's behalf? Doesn't this whole strategy just favor families with disposable income to spare, the exact families who probably need this advantage the least? Also fair, and worth naming honestly rather than glossing over. This specific strategy does require some amount of discretionary family income to fund, which means it's not equally available to every family regardless of financial circumstances, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. Even a partial contribution, matching a fraction of a teen's summer earnings rather than the full amount, still captures a meaningful share of the same decades-long compounding advantage, since even a smaller amount invested this early outperforms a much larger amount invested a decade later, which means partial participation is still genuinely worthwhile, not an all-or-nothing decision. There's a specific pattern worth naming around families with more than one teenager too, since the same mechanism simply repeats for each child individually. Each teen with their own documented earned income qualifies for their own separate account and their own separate contribution limit, which means a family with two working teenagers isn't splitting one opportunity between them. They're looking at two entirely independent windows, each with its own multi-decade runway, opening and closing on its own separate timeline tied to that specific child's own earning years as a minor. So here's where we land, plainly. This isn't about pressuring every teenager into retirement planning, or suggesting a family without extra income to spare is doing something wrong by not opening one. It's about a specific, narrow window, earned income during the minor years, that most families never even realize exists until it's already closed. Camille opened the account for Zoe the same week she learned about it, contributed the full amount of that summer's lifeguarding paycheck, and started having the conversation with her about what compounding actually means, years before Zoe will ever need to manage the account entirely on her own. So the concept has time to actually sink in before it matters. The point was never that every dollar a teenager earns needs to go toward retirement. It's that a handful of years exist where money gets an almost unfair head start, and almost nobody explains that window exists before it's already closed for good, quietly. The moment a kid ages out of being a minor with earned income, and the specific version of this opportunity simply stops being available in the same form ever again. It's worth naming honestly that this window really is temporary in a way most financial opportunities aren't. An adult can open a Roth IRA at any age and still benefit meaningfully from compounding, but nobody gets to go back and recreate the specific combination of a teenager's typically zero tax bracket and a 50-year runway once those years have passed. Whatever gets captured during this window is, in a real sense, permanently locked in a way that later contributions, however large, can't fully replicate. If your teenager has any documented earned income this year, look into whether a custodial Roth IRA makes sense before the year actually ends. If this helped, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, did you know teenagers could even legally have their own Roth IRA before watching this video? I'll see you in the next one.